Hello and welcome to another episode of Culture Vultures on the Let's Have It Network. Today I'm joined by Fergus Mitchell. Woo! You're going to have a clap and things.
Okay.
That's good. And today we're going to be talking about Paul Simon's Graceland.
Yep.
So let's get into it, Fergus. Why Graceland? Why Paul Simon?
Well, why both of those? I think, I've been a fan of Paul Simon for a really, really long time. And like my dad was a huge fan of Simon and Garfunkel. And I guess a lot of people who are watching, listening, their dad or perhaps granddad or grandparents would be fans because they were like huge in the kind of early mid-60s. Mm-hmm. And then they had like a falling out, as happens to me, and ended up as solo artists, and Paul Simon was kind of like the far more successful of the two. But he had like a run of really successful solo albums through the 70s, and then kind of things caught up with him in the kind of early 80s, so things went sort of downhill for him. Two somewhat unsuccessful albums in a row. And I think kind of also what was pretty galling was they had in 1981 Simon and Garfunkel had a concert, very large concert in Central Park in New York, which was like 500,000 people. It was a huge deal, but you could see Paul Simon was a bit like, okay, so people are only interested in the old stuff. So he was like at a kind of low ebb at that point, and he was married to Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia, out of the Star Wars films, and that was, they'd just divorced. More was to come, but that was how things were. So he was like kind of pretty low ebb at that point, and I think he was kind of maybe looking for something he did not know what to kind of lead him out. But I just think he's been, Graceland is like I'm going to try really hard during this to not use the phrase world music because I think it's meaningless. It's like all music that's not like in the charts is world music, which is nonsense. So. But he was always a fan of sourcing music and sounds from other cultural traditions, and incorporating them into kind of American pop music. And so he just had an ear for it. I think he was always kind of listening around. And then he was like, fatefully in 1984, he was handed a cassette by Heidi Berg, who was a musician on Saturday Night Live. I think it was called Accordion Hits Volume 2. No one knows about Volume 1. But it was a handwritten cassette label, and it had this township music from South Africa on it, as was the way with these things. There was no liner notes or anything like that to it, so he had really no idea what it was, but he just loved the sound and kind of recognised it as something he could work with and use in some way. So he kind of got him up and running, I guess, at that stage.
Yeah, you've stepped on quite a lot of the stuff that I've got here.
Yeah, that's good. I thought how quickly could we get through it, but yeah.
Yeah, so he had released, was it Hearts and Bones? Or was it Heart and Bones was his, was the album before Graceland?
Yeah, that's
and it
right.
was a bomb.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, it's a lovely album, and I've listened to it a few times. There's some great songs on it, but what it wasn't was like there were no hits on it.
Yeah.
And that was the problem. And he'd done previously One Trick Pony in 1980, which was actually a movie and an album. I've not seen the movie, and a few people have, I think. But it was a really kind of self-indulgent project, and it didn't work. And I think he was like, "Okay, no worries. I've got this other album coming up." So in fact, Hearts and Bones was started out as being a new Simon and Garfunkel record, but they fell out for reasons which are quite hard to nail down. But he ended up just going, "Well, do you know what? I'm just going to do this myself," with mixed results.
Yeah, because he had done like the big concert, as you said, and then he was going to go out and tour.
Yeah,
with
that's right. Yeah,
as well. So everybody thought that album was going to be the new.
Absolutely, and people were dying to hear it as well. But it just kind of fizzled out, and I think that would have been two or so years after the concert, so he didn't really have the bounce from that show to kind of hit the road with. So by the time he actually ended up, I mean, I think it was quite acrimonious. He didn't tell Garfunkel he was going to scrub his vocals from him and kind of went ahead and did it anyway. You get the impression that Paul Simon's not always the most personable.
No, I've seen interviews and things like that. It does seem a bit kind of off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think he just kind of decided to kind of crack on with it anyway and do this. And I said I think there's some really lovely tunes on it, but there's not very many floor fillers on it, I would say. I think that's a fair comment. So yeah, totally ready. You know, maybe just at a low point in his life for lots of different reasons, and was I don't know, more receptive. There's kind of descriptions of him, quite tragic scene of him having, you know, built, he's had folks in to build a new house that was meant to be for him and Carrie Fisher on the shores of Long Island, and he just let them keep building the house, and he was just sat there listening to baseball matches on the radio and smoking a joint. I think I'm right in saying. Hopefully that's not so overstretching. And then once he got hold of this cassette, he was kind of listening to that amongst a load of other stuff. But that was kind of something that seemed to just, he kind of talks about, he kept coming back to that cassette, you know, and I think it took him quite some time to kind of start thinking, well, you know, maybe this is a direction to go in. But those things were like seeded away as he was going.
Yeah, and he'd given the tape to people at Warner Brothers to see if they could source who it was, and then that's when it led them to South Africa.
Well, it was that was I kind of think as well, because Warner Brothers obviously had been, you know, a big player for them, but I think he felt, and then he might not have been wrong, that they just weren't that fussed about what he did. So like for him to come and say, you know, like, can you find who this is on this? And at that point, I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about apartheid and all that stuff that was happening, but they were able to identify it as being South African music, and they had a guy called Hilton Rosenthal who was in Johannesburg, and he was like the Warner Brothers guy for South Africa, and you know, we sent the tape to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know these guys," and it was the Boyoyo Boys. Was the original act that was sung a song called Gumboots, which turned up in a version on Graceland a little later on. So he was able to kind of make that connection, and I think Paul Simon had, in the past, he'd kind of acquired music like El Condor Pasa, which was one of the earlier albums. He'd just kind of bought that song and then repurposed it as a Simon and Garfunkel song. So I think his original plan was to just kind of like buy this stuff, and I'm not sure who, you may know who it was actually first suggested that he went over to South Africa, which was I'm tempted to say Lorne Michaels of Saturday Night Live, because it was the sort of thing he seemed to kind of come in every so often. But there was a few ideas, there was definitely a suggestion made. So like, you know, why don't you go to South Africa? And there was actually thousands of really good reasons why he shouldn't go to South Africa, which we can kind of get into. Yeah, well,
that was going to be my next thing. So he did go to South Africa in February of 1985, and now this is going to be a list. It's really, it's not nice, but it has to be mentioned. So he went over in February. In March 21st, 47 people were killed by the police at the 25th commemoration of the Sharpeville massacre. June the 27th was an assassination of anti-apartheid activists, and then there was backlash from anti-apartheid demonstrations worldwide, which declared a state of emergency in South Africa while he was there. And then there was anti-apartheid lawyer Victoria, I can't even say the name, was assassinated by the government-backed death squads. So it was just kind of massacre after massacre. And he was in a studio just making music.
Well, he spent those 2 weeks in Johannesburg and essentially went from the hotel to the studio and back again. Like he didn't have any interaction at all with actual, if you want to call it, real South Africa. He never went to townships, or he never went to Soweto, never really walked the street at any point. So he didn't have any connection. And I suspect he didn't really have any interest in it either. You get the impression from reading that, you know, he's a musician first, second, and third, and all he cared about was the music. And I don't think he ever displayed any social conscience or political interest or anything like that up to that point. I mean, that I think came, but he definitely did not go over there to make any kind of statement or anything like that. And that was. I mean, it was a no-win situation, really, for someone going over at that stage. That, as you say, at that particular time was when things were really, really hotting up in South Africa. And it's worth, I guess, talking a little bit about apartheid because, you know, it is the background to all of this. And I'll try not to go into too great a depth, although I have been reading up a bit about it. So what I'll also not do is call it apartheid, which I had to listen to a podcast recently where the guy just would not stop calling it apartheid, which is not what it's about. So apartheid is an Afrikaans word for separateness, basically the state of being apart. So, and it was kind of a formalization of racism, essentially, but it was a bit more than that. You kind of hear it compared to sort of segregation in the southern US and things, and actually was quite different from that because segregation in the southern US was all about like kind of letting things happen. So, you know, the bus companies had rules, cities had rules about drinking fountains and toilets and public facilities and things like that. So it varied from place to place across the South. The general atmosphere of racial intolerance across the South, but it did vary. Actual rules varied. Whereas in South Africa, it was like the law. You didn't get away with being racist in South Africa. You had to be racist. That was the law. And it is really quite mind-boggling. I mean, I thought I knew about it, but it's really quite astonishing. It's something that was like formally introduced into law in 1948. I actually didn't, you know, it wasn't repealed until 1994. It really is not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And what it was originally, going way back, South Africa had always been quite segregated from the Dutch settlers to the British arriving. It was, you know, two separate cultures. And then when gold and diamonds were discovered, that ramped things up because suddenly there was a lot of money around and there was a lot of miners needed, and the miners tended to be black workers, and the mine owners were concerned about stuff getting stolen from the mines, and they introduced this system of passes that the workers had to have.
Right, yeah.
So this is, you know, it wasn't their idea, but it was kind of building on what had already been established, a kind of lack of trust of the black population. So they were required to be able to produce these papers wherever they went to identify where they were, where they worked, where they lived, and so forth. And that, so kind of things just naturally developed all the way through the coming few years up until the Second World War, when the National Party came in. We were I don't want to get too far into it, but you know, the white population of South Africa is divided into the English speakers and Afrikaans speakers, who are the sort of descended from the Dutch. And there were more Afrikaners than there were English speakers, but the English speakers tended to have like the sort of be more powerful. They were like wealthier and so forth. So when the Afrikaner National Party got in, they wanted to ensure that there were jobs for white Afrikaners after the war, particularly those that had served. So they started to kind of ramp up this separateness, this apartheid. So that started in 1948, and right away it steamed right in there with you're not allowed to marry across races, into you're not allowed to have sex with someone who's not in your race, and that was just the beginning. Like it just went that every single aspect of your life was defined by your race by law.
That's the thing. It is by law. There's
absolutely
like frowned upon. Or
no.
Yeah.
And it was you know, actually quite popular amongst the Afrikaner population. Not so much amongst everyone else, but you had this very strict kind of coding of race as well. They did a horrible thing. They did was a pencil test to see, you know, if you were. You'd had to apply for a pass to say, and the pass would say what race you were, and that would define what you were able to do. And if you, and I'm using some outdated phrases and describing, but this is what they were described as in these documents. So if you were black, you were referred to as Bantu, and if you were mixed race, you were coloured. If you were white, and if you were Asian, you were somebody of Southeast Asian. Indian region kind of origin, and as time went by, none of them, apart from white people, had the vote or could stand for office or these things. So they did a thing. If you came in and claimed to be coloured, they had a thing called a pencil test. They'd put a pencil in your hair and get you to shake your head, and if the pencil fell out, then they reckoned that meant you were coloured and not pure black. And this is the government doing this to their own people. So that was the level of intrusiveness that they were putting into. I mean, I just read this the other night, and I looked like you did when I heard it. I was like, okay, that's unbelievable. So then the kind of next stage from that was that they established these kind of homelands, which were really, really poor quality land that were quite near cities, but not too near cities. And you ended up having being moved there and made a citizen of these places. So that would mean that you were given full citizenship of these, what eventually became in South Africa separate nations, but actually no one else recognised them as such. But that meant that the government could then take your passport off you and issue you with documents that said you now lived in this. They were known as Bantustans, effectively. But they were corrupt and rotten places as well. But that was another attempt to kind of disenfranchise and effectively reduce the black population. And also, really importantly, were the townships, which is where this music kind of originated. So these were suburbs, but kind of like shantytown suburbs built by the government for black workers in mines and factories. And those were where black people had to live. White people weren't allowed to go there. So there was no mingling happening. And you had your papers that allowed you to travel to and from these places, but there was nothing really there. There was no television in South Africa anyway until 1976 or so, and there were no cinemas in the townships, and there was really nothing. The literacy was incredibly low, but there was a lot of music, and interestingly, also music from all over South Africa and beyond. It kind of melting pot, if you like, of the townships. So they had a really, really strong kind of homemade musical tradition. So that's what folk did to let off steam and relax and communicate, and also complain. Because you could write songs in different languages that the government wouldn't necessarily know what you were talking about because they had no interest in that kind of thing. So that was the sound. That's my long, compact way of saying that's where the sound that Paul Simon heard on those cassettes came from. From that mixed up, oppressed culture who really had no other way of expressing themselves and no real way of communicating with the outside world as well. I think people forget how difficult it was to hear music that wasn't local at that period. But yeah, that cassette making its way across the Atlantic was quite an achievement.
It was because it was people kind of playing in the townships that were just like guitars and penny whistles, and obviously penny whistle was like really prominent in Graceland as well.
That's right. Yeah, it's a really interesting point about that because Paul Simon actually talks about the fact that all the musical instruments that people played were portable. Like you don't hear a whole lot of music for the grand piano coming out of these places because you might have to just pick up and run, or you might have to go somewhere else and work. So there was no sense of permanence. So guitars, penny whistles, and really prominently the accordion was a really popular instrument. And that kind of accordion, the history of the accordion kind of links the album musically across all the different genres, which we can round up with if you like. But it does seem to me that Paul Simon got that the sort of traveling nature of the music was really, really important as well. It's a theme for the album, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's as good as we're going to get. We'll talk about apartheid and things like that. I mean, it is important to talk about it because it was obviously going on as he was making this album, and he's said in interviews like before and things like that he didn't really, as you say, it was just all about the music and things like that. But then after that was talking about apartheid. Do you think he was kind of pressured into talking about it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he wasn't totally unaware of it. People had spoken to him before, so notably Harry Belafonte, who was popularised calypso as a musical form for his sins, but also was a very prominent civil rights activist, and he did in 1985 when We Are the World came out, and Paul Simon was involved in that. Harry Belafonte was also, and Quincy Jones. He spoke to effectively his black friends and said, "What do you think?" And they were quite supportive of the idea, but Harry Belafonte said you should really go and speak to the ANC, who then were a pressure group in an underground pressure group in South Africa, famously led by Nelson Mandela, who was in jail at this moment. And Paul Simon thought about it and then decided not to. And he kind of said, well, he didn't want anyone's permission to make music, which, okay, I get that. But there had been since 1980 a cultural ban, not a ban, like a boycott that was official United Nations policy that really specified that you could not perform in South Africa. You couldn't, export music. Really had to be no cultural crossover with South Africa, and that included sport as well, which is probably more significant than the music side of it, to be honest. But it was pretty clear and pretty unambiguous that you weren't meant to do it. And as you said, with those events that were happening at that time, it was really kind of high on the agenda. And it's quite hard to believe that Paul Simon didn't think more about that. But and I don't, as I said, I don't think he did it as a statement. I think he just kind of get the impression that apartheid was a bit of a nuisance. To him, you know what I mean? He was like, he's quite annoyed about it because it meant like he couldn't record as freely as he wanted to, and the musicians that when he did go over to South Africa and they did get into the studio with these musicians, well, they had to leave at 5 o'clock to get home to the townships, otherwise they'd be arrested. So, and he found that really annoying because he wanted to keep going, and I can see him getting a bit of a strop about it, but so not really getting the big picture at all. I don't think. No. But he did get, there was kind of Hilton Rosenthal and a few of his kind of local contacts. They did manage to get quite a range of musicians together, including the Boyoyo Boys from the original tape, and it spent those 2 weeks in the studio. And just, I think it was quite different from Paul Simon's normal, because Paul Simon, from all accounts, is really quite a perfectionist, and he would normally have the songs written before he went into the studio, but probably just because of like the wheels had come off his life so much, he was like, do you know what? I'm just going to go in there and jam. Yeah, well, that's that. Yeah, a lot of the songs just came for them sitting jamming, which is just and picking things up and new sounds, and and I don't think he had any particular. I mean, he came back with, I think, the kind of basis of 5 of the tracks already in place by the time the things that were going to be there. But he was over with Roy Halley, who was his long-term engineer and had been with him since the kind of early 60s, and they took all of these tapes and brought them back to New York and started to kind of work on them and edit and cut and really a huge edit session, which took a fantastic long time. And this is quite early at kind of digital technology as well, so they were working with tape a lot of the time and having to play tapes forwards and backwards. And there's the famous bass section from "You Can Call Me Al," which was a great little bass hook that Paul Simon wanted extended, so he just kind of reversed it. So it plays one way and then plays back on itself, which I only found that out like 2 weeks ago. Oh, amazing! Reversed. I know, when you hear it, you're like, okay, that's what's happened. And it's actually, I don't know if it still is, but at the time it was regarded as being actually impossible to play live because of that. But I'm sure someone's mastered it by now. Of course. But that thing of just kind of grabbing stuff in that session and bringing it back seemed to kind of work with how he was feeling at the time, and he was kind of putting himself. I think he did guide things in the studio sessions, but I think it was more of a collaborative process than he was used to, and he did kind of share credit with many of the musicians that had worked with him on those tracks, and he wasn't always terribly good at that, as we will probably discover. But he also, he was kind of aware of the fact that there were pressures on him being there, and he paid everyone there an enormous amount of money. So I think the normal rate at that time would have been $15 an hour for these musicians, and they would go into a studio and do 10 songs a day and then go home. But he was paying them $200 an hour, which was much more than you would have got in New York at that time.
Yeah.
And so that was his way of, paying his way. And you could flip that around and say, well, okay, what's he paying for? It wouldn't have been more better to give them full co-writing, and rather than paying them the 200 now, you could be paying them thousands. But that's the way he worked. And so he did share credits with some of them, but they were all well paid. Criticism is that maybe only the musicians who were in that room benefited from that. And I don't know, long view is perhaps South African music in general didn't.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll come to that.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my next.
Yeah.
question. So, would you say it was exploitative? Well, getting in because it done, as you say, like Gumboots and stuff like that. Basically, just went in and picked parts of the music that he liked, and then when he done Homeless, he had heard the way they used their voices and stuff like that, and different tracks, and says, "Can you do this exact thing for this song? Do you think it might have been?" It's easy to see why it could be classed.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line. I mean, I never really have much time for the idea of cultural appropriation or anything like that, because I think culture is cultural appropriation. I mean, that's how things expand, and that's how art and all these things develop, by taking things from other places and other mediums and things like that. So I don't think it's necessarily exploitative to do that. And do I think he was a little bit rapacious with his deals? Yeah, probably. I think that that thing in songwriting, they say change a word, earn a third. I think I think he probably could have gone into that with a different spirit, and it may have just been, it might have been ego, it might have been naivete, whatever. I'm not sure, but I think that I can certainly see the exploitative side of that. Yeah. But do you know that if you talk to, or as people did, who talked to the musicians years afterwards, Joseph Shabalala of Ladysmith Black Mambazo, he was full of praise. Yeah. So it built their career.
They became a household name.
Absolutely became a household name, and Paul Simon was like in awe of them right from the start. When he was in Johannesburg, he was kind of nervous to approach them because he thought they were like musical gods. And Joseph turned up at the last day of recording, and they actually just got on like a house on fire. And so I think if you were in that room, if you were that select group of musicians, then I think you benefited from it. Maybe others didn't. Particularly the American musicians that he worked with later on, there was a lot of bad blood with them. The last two tracks on the album are in the kind of Zydeco Cajun style and kind of Mexican American style, Los Lobos, and Rockin' Dupsy was the band leader of that was Your Mother. Is that right? That was Your Mother? I think that's I should know. This is what we're talking about. Really. And he didn't give them songwriting credits.
Yeah, that's really kind of Cajun song. Yeah, it didn't make sense. It is just kind of his name that's on it.
Yeah,
but it didn't sound like.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think you could sort of say maybe that's something to do with Americans' more kind of litigious minds, that they expected that, whereas South Africans didn't. Now, maybe that was naive, or maybe that was just their cultural practice or whatever. I don't know. If you're a session musician and you're expecting an early rate and then go home, and maybe you're not thinking on that level, and maybe people should have been looking out for them, but it's not what happened.
No, but I mean, yeah, as I say, they have Ladysmith Black Mambazo they were on Saturday Night Live with them as well when they done that, and I think there was like they had pushed back the release date, and then Paul Simon got together with somebody from Ladysmith and says, "Why don't we just write another song?"
Yeah, that's right.
Done Diamonds in the Souls of Shoes.
Which is a beautiful song, and I think there's some fabulous stuff about that, particularly because he brought Ladysmith Black Mambazo over to New York, and they had some time in between the shows, and they asked Paul Simon how to get a permit to go to Central Park, which it's just one of these things where you realize, oh, okay, that's where they were from, and that was their mindset. And I think things like that were rather than the trip to South Africa, which as I said, I don't really think had any effect on Paul Simon at all. But it was more of what happened when he got back, and he kind of almost the realization of what he'd done, stroke achieved in recording that. I think that started to kind of feed in a bit to how he felt about the whole thing, and it certainly there was like an enormous backlash to it, which I just don't get the feeling he saw coming.
No. I mean, that's as you say, he's just a musician.
Yeah.
He just wants to make good music.
Yeah.
He definitely did.
Yeah.
No,
He absolutely did. Yeah. Do you have a favorite track on it?
It changes every day.
Yeah.
Probably is. You can call me Al just because my name's Al.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking that. I just thought that as we sat down, that I should remember to reference that, but I never did. Yeah, it's a great track, and it was like that was a really significant track because it was, I think, the first single that was released off the album, and part of kind of Paul Simon's anxiety was like before the album was he was like in his early 40s and he was like looking at MTV and all these guys like Prince and artists like Madonna and thinking, right, this is the next generation. I'm has been effectively, and then they recorded the video for You Can Call Me Al, which is hilarious. Yeah, it's great. It's real simple.
It's one of the best videos ever. But that was the thing. Lorne Michaels said to him, like Chevy loves the song. And all the words. Like, we'll just get into this room then.
Yeah, exactly. It's well worth having a look at. It's just a very simple kind of deadpan comedy thing. Yeah. Chevy Chase being Chevy Chase, a blowhard, just takes over. Paul Simon sings the harmonies, and he's basically just lifting and shifting musical instruments all the time. So it's like, and it's really that was kind of that really hit the music scene right between the eyes, because they were like, not only was it funny video with a big star in Chevy Chase, but also like, what was this sound? What was going on here? This is new. And as I said, it was really hard. You didn't hear that music. You didn't hear it. You could occasionally pick up things. It was a tape I heard, which was, I think, the Indestructible Beat of Soweto, which is a compilation album of music from that era, which was kicking around, and it was that was after. Basically, I think it came out after Graceland or around about the same time, but it wasn't source material. It wasn't something that Paul Simon had heard. It came out around about that time, and that was a cassette that was kicking around that you could. I was playing at work, and I was like, "What is that?" Yeah. That's amazing. So I think I think "Boy in the Bubble" is my favorite track, and it's a super dense, complicated song, accordion heavy, but also features these kind of gated reverb drums from the 80s. From every 80s band from Phil Collins onwards. So there's a clash in there. And lyrically, it's very complex and really quite dark for what's quite a joyful album, but really totally on the money now. Like the themes he's talking about, like terrorism, global insecurity and all these kind of things are, I don't know if you check, they have not gone away. No. So they're all relevant. So one of the things that he was criticized for was not being political in the songs, and really part of reference to terrorism. Unfortunately, there was no political statement about apartheid or about oppression or anything like that in there. I think he made the point that, not in so many words, but kind of say, well, look, I'm a wealthy Jewish white man who's spent 2 weeks in South Africa, and I really can't be writing songs about how hard it is to live in Soweto. True. Do you know? And it was very much his album, so it was his voice that was there. So, okay, you could have had a guest artist on or something like that, but it's not that kind of album, I don't think. And I kind of do subscribe to the point of view that, anger doesn't age very well, and joy does. And I can see why he wanted to do something joyful rather than... I also, as I said, I don't think he felt that way. Yeah. I don't think he was angry about it. I just don't think it was his mindset at all. I think he was just absolutely in love with this music and this style of music and these guys. I mean, he genuinely loved the musicians, and he worked with them for decades afterwards as well. So it's not like it was a flash in the pan thing. He was, they were his touring band for a long time afterwards. So yeah, it was a real thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I lost my train of thought there, but just wanted to shout out Bakithe Kamalo, which is the bassist.
Yeah.
The reason that he got his bass line and You Can Call Me Al is he went up to me and says, I really want something that I can do myself, and it's my birthday.
That's brilliant. That's fantastic.
So he recorded the You Can Call Me Al bass line on his birthday.
Oh, that's great.
And that kind of shows a bit of kind of naivety as well, and it's quite like kind of childlike.
Yeah,
as well.
it is, isn't it? Yeah. But I think it was kind of interesting to these musicians who didn't actually, a lot of them know who Paul Simon was, because that kind of cultural boycott went both ways. So they would really, the Beatles, I think, were banned quite early on in South Africa. So there wasn't any music coming in either. So I think one or two of them may have known some of Paul Simon's solo stuff, but not many. So they weren't like in awe of the fact that they were working with the great Paul Simon, because they didn't know who Paul Simon was to a large extent. But they were in Ovation Studios in Johannesburg, which was the most high tech recording studio south of the Sahara. I would imagine, certainly in South Africa, it was way up. So it was a big deal, and they knew they were working with a perfectionist, and they obviously had the respect. They could see right away that he was a great musician, and I think that cut across the whole way through, and that was mutual, of course, as well. There were different traditions, but they could see what was happening musically. And I like the accordionist whose name I forget, but we'll look it up, who played in the original break in Boy in the Bubble. Like, he was like quite unruly. They said he couldn't get him to kind of stick to it. And actually, I think Paul Simon went, "You actually know what? I just like that shambolic as it is."
Yeah.
Because it's got energy, and it's also quite otherworldly for a pop for the opening track on a mainstream album to have that sound in there is quite something. I think. What is the name of the accordionist? Have you got his name there? Right, I hate to get that wrong.
No, of course. But as you say, it was just the noises that were coming out of the album. The first time I heard it was I think it was the 25th anniversary release.
Yeah.
I got it because my mum, she grew up with, she always played Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah.
So like I always knew it was if she was ironing and stuff like that, it was always Simon and Garfunkel it was on.
That's right.
If she was playing Fairground by Simply Red, you knew that there was a lot of cleaning going on. It was best just to stay out the way.
Just to keep clear.
And my daughter is called April, after April Come She Will.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
so that's sweet.
Yeah. So
that's brilliant. Oh, what a connection.
So it's I've always loved him anyway, but I'd never, when I picked up a Paul Simon album, it just wasn't what I thought it would be.
No, absolutely.
It's kind of otherworldly, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Struggling to get reception in here,
so I
just need to call him the accordion.
I know, I might have written it down somewhere, which would be great. Excuse me, you can cut all this nonsense while I look up what I'm talking about. I've not to have used all these notes. A bit scrappy. Maybe I didn't write it down. Quite possible.
We're worse than him. We're in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Exploiting them as well.
I know, that's dreadful. I can't find this now. That's annoying.
Oh no. I'll include his name in the title of the podcast.
Right, okay.
That's what I'll do.
I don't know how you'll cut around all that. But
no.
Anyway.
Here we go. How do we? Forere Motleheloa.
Forere Motleheloa.
Well, there you go. That sounds better than what I said.
Okay, I wonder how. Let's just go for Ferrari. Ferrari?
Yeah, Ferrari, yeah.
Yeah. So if I say, which I didn't have the glasses on for, and then he had that accordion break that's played by, I don't have his full name, Ferrari. Who was a bit chaotic and I think Paul Simon was trying to kind of rein him in a little bit, and it just wasn't happening. And he said, "You know what? Just leave it. I like it." And it does produce that mad energy at the start of that song, which is off kilter right away. But they're like, "Oh no, this is not going to be a regular listen." And I think that's all deliberate. Of course, it is. That's how he knew about putting records. Him and Roy Halley knew about putting records together, so that was a definite statement that things weren't going to go according to plan.
Because it was like 10-minute jam sessions and things like that. As you're saying, with like editing, they would to go back and to move 8s and 4s for different places.
Absolutely.
And just come together with that album is.
I know, and to make it sound as not necessarily slick, but as accomplished as it does. Is testament to some real skill. I mean, editing is an incredible skill, as whoever's putting this together will discover. But I think there's also that kind of that method of working is probably what caused them problems with Rock and Doopsie and with Los Lobos, because he kind of used the same approach in the studio with them, which is like, let's just go in and jam. And Los Lobos at that point were a big band. They'd like had the third biggest selling album of 1985, I think, and thereabouts anyway, when How Will the Wolf Survive was like a huge album. They were big names, and they weren't kind of into this whole like let's just go in and jam thing.
Session musician.
Exactly. I think that was a bit of what was going on, but Paul Simon was kind of still in that mindset of like, no, we're just going to create here. So that did cause a lot of ill will, I think, because they he did the same thing. He didn't give. I don't think he gave either of them a credit. He may have given Rock and Doopsie. I don't think so.
No, I don't. The last two, I think it is just.
It's just him.
Yeah.
Bad form.
No, I know, and you can tell it's not just him.
No, it so isn't, is it? It so isn't just him. So yeah, you kind of alluded to the push the album back and then recorded Diamonds and the Soles of the Shoes, which is a fabulous track. It's just absolutely beautiful. And he'd also had like guest artists, including the Everly Brothers, who he was like a huge fan of when he was younger. So that must have been great. And Linda Ronstadt, who was a pal of his, who had appeared at the Sun City Resort in South Africa, which is a whites-only entertainment complex, which kind of was there to get around the cultural boycott. But it became the target of another song that was out, in fact, an album that was out in 1985, 86, and the song Ain't Gonna Play Sun City, which kind of targeted artists who had, and lots of big names had played there, and a few had apologised, a few had refused to, but many had just done, it's a gig. What the hell? Nothing I can do about it. So, this is what I do for a living. And Linda Ronstadt was one of the acts that was named on it. So Paul Simon was asked if he wanted to appear on that song, because he hadn't played Sun City. That was it. He was in the clear, but Linda Ronstadt had, and out of loyalty to her, he said, no, I don't want to be anything involved with that. And it was interesting as well, because Steve Van Zandt of the E Street Band and Sopranos fame does all sorts. Lilyhammer as well. He was kind of the driving force on the American side of Artists Against Apartheid. And he had strong opinions on Paul Simon, I think probably anyway, but this didn't do anything to bring them together. And Steve Van Zandt tells the story of how there was a militant terrorist group in South Africa who had Paul Simon on their kill list for recording this album, and Steve Van Zandt says he kind of managed to, talk them down from it and say, look, really wouldn't do any good to kill Paul Simon just now. So wouldn't achieve anything. Might be counter to your movements. Whether that actually happened, I don't know. But there was definitely, as well as kind of Western disapproval of what he, the principle of what he'd done, there was also kind of quite a strong African backlash against it as well, for the same reasons, because it was seen as being supportive of the white economy, which was the only economy really, over there. So I can understand why. But it was a hit album, absolutely a huge hit album, like Grammy Album of the Year, multi-award winner. And then he followed up with a tour in 1987, February 9th. So 2 years after it basically started the whole thing going, and that really was billed as an African experience. So we had Hugh Masekela, John, who'd been exiled from South Africa, Miriam Makeba, Mama Africa was on the tour as well. So he'd really kind of corralled a lot of people who hadn't actually been on the album, but to make it an African showcase. And he'd, I think, at that point realized what he had done, stroke what he could do with it, and so that was running through 1987. And the one of the final shows they played was in Harare, in Zimbabwe, which is the closest they could get to South Africa. And there was kind of threats, security threats all the way through while he was doing it. And at some point there was a grenade thrown into one of the rooms storing musical equipment and things like that. So there was, there's a real threat of violence, but he persevered with it, and it was a hit tour and kind of landmark tour as well for him. So he was, not just him, but he had, as he said, he'd made big names out of Ladysmith, Black Mambazo, and various others, but he was like way back on top again. And I think, interestingly, the book, Robert Hilburn book, which I've been kind of reading on this topic, it talks about how it seemed that Paul Simon actually was changed by this experience, and he became, he was involved in more kind of charitable works and so forth, and he gave, sums of money for in the US and in Africa to kind of help others. And I don't think that was the Paul Simon that started out with Graceland. So it's interesting how sometimes people do the right things for the wrong reasons. I think that's kind of the thing for him. And I think musically, it's his point was to say that it was mostly an African album, but it had the Zydeco and the Mexican American twist to it as well. And his point, kind of linking it through the accordion, which appears in all of the songs, was kind of to say that it was an album about movement and motion and transience and things like that, and just like saying that what am I trying to say? What's the word? Transience?
Yeah, I mean,
instability.
A lot of words.
Yeah, I do. But I don't know what they mean. So it was an album about movement and displacement and all of these things, and lots of the songs refer to it, and there's lots of moving and travel and all these things in it. And I think that's musically his point was, maybe that came after the fact. Maybe he discovered that as he was making it, that he'd written an album about the movement of people, I guess, and a joyful, hopeful album about that as well. It wasn't kind of, crying over the fact that there was refugees and things like that, but it was acknowledging that there were, and that if you want to be big about it, that we're all on. He was definitely on a journey, and maybe we're all on a kind of journey, and maybe we're all driving to Graceland with our sons from our first marriage.
Yeah,
I haven't. That there's still time.
Yeah,
I have some, so it could work. I don't know, but yeah,
that's Paul Simon Graceland. Then
happy with that.
Summed up into round about an hour.
Think so?
Yeah,
you there?
That was, very informative.
Good. I hope it was somewhat entertaining and not too.
Oh no, definitely
not too. But is there anything you wanted to pick up on?
No, because you covered it all.
Oh really?
Yeah. I thought I was going. This has been the easiest podcast I've ever done in my life.
How many of you recorded?
I think this will be number. I don't know, I'm not meant to number them, but I think this will be like number 6. I think.
Right.
So.
Have you started releasing them?
No, not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet. But we'll get there. Is there anything you want to plug then? Since we're at the
gosh, yeah, I never thought of that. I've not been a guest on anything before. Have I got you booked in for another?
No.
Laugh yet? We'll do that at some point. Because you were great.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
I will just pick up on something. I'll get into the mindset and think what I'm going to say. So if you could just ask me if I've got anything to plug.
Do you have anything to plug?
Of course I do. Yeah. So as you will have gathered, I'm not a comedian, but I do run comedy shows. So I run you've been on both of them. Yeah. So open sauce at the Rum Shack in Queen's Park, which is where we met.
Yeah.
And it is an open comedy night for folk to, not totally open. I do a bit of, no rubbish. So that is on the second Sunday of each month at the Rum Shack in Glasgow. And then my main show, I've been running for about 7 years now, is Cross My Laugh, which is at the Glad Cafe, a little further up, opposite corner of Queen's Park in Shawlands. That's normally on the first Saturday of the month, and it's a big show.
It's brilliant.
Great fun too. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It's really
You were
good,
great.
yeah.
You were just great.
Thanks.
So that's my thing. I also have my own podcast because that's why podcast people go on podcasts, don't they? So, and that is called Pod My Laugh, and I've got another one which is kind of in the pipeline and probably called Lingo, but I don't know exactly. That's going to be a language.
Oh right, okay.
Thing, but because I do know some words.
Yeah.
So that's all happening, and you can get your tickets on the online from that.
Yeah.
So
I'll post the links when this
amazing.
goes up. But thank you very much for coming in. This was absolutely fantastic.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for having me and listening. That was great.
It's another episode of Culture Vultures. See you later.